Can we dive into your book? So for
Please.
anybody that's watching this on YouTube, this is amazing. Get this book. Alex, can you talk a little bit about this book? Now, I know that you have read thousands and thousands of books in your lifetime, and this was kind of born from understanding entrepreneurs, right? Like diving into their. Can you tell people a little bit about your entrepreneurial
Yeah.
path?
You whenever I started talking about this again, I get chills because as a kid, when I was young, I was different than all the other kids, and I knew it. I was the type of kid that was so different. I didn't really get along great in school, didn't get along great with my peers, didn't really have a place that I belonged. And so I knew I wanted to have some level of success. I had seen my father lose a business and really struggle in his business. My family struggled for money when I was a kid. I grew up working with my dad in a swap meet in a border town. So it was, sitting in a booth all day, 120-degree heat. And if anybody challenges that temperature, we were in Yuma, Arizona, or Calexico, California, which was ridiculously hot. And I would sit at an intersection where my dad had one of the bigger stands, and there was a guy who was pitching mops on one end, a guy who was pitching chamois in another place, and a guy who was pitching food slicers in another place. And so I'd sit there and listen to these people sell all day. And, as a kid, I thought I was so far away from this thing called success. My family didn't have a lot of money. I saw opulence and a lot of wealth around me. We lived in Orange County, California. I had friends whose families had tons of money, so I knew what it looked like. And I started trying to read personal development. And one of the first books that I read was Unlimited Power by Tony Robbins, which was like this. And I read it when I was really young. In fact, when I was 10 years old, I listened to the tape set for Dr. Wayne Dyer's Unawakened Life. And actually ended up meeting him later in life too, before he passed away. And so as a kid, I read Tony Robbins, I read Wayne Dyer, and I started reading more personal development. And there was so much conflict in the books that they started arguing with each other, and it got overwhelming. And as a kid, I couldn't reconcile it. And so I started reading about successful people. And I obsessively have chased the stories of successful people my whole life. I would hear about somebody historic that resonated, and I would read about them. Einstein stood out to me. So I read about Einstein, and I found out that he failed algebra. He couldn't tie his shoes until he was 4. I started seeing this reflection of the kind of sensitivities and weaknesses that I had. I read about Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, who supposedly sat under an apple tree and an apple hit his head and he discovered gravity. Well, the real story is Newton was such an antisocial person that they made up the story about the apple tree. It was an apple falling out of the tree that he saw, but because he was by himself most of the time. And so the more that I would read about successful people, the more I absorbed about successful people, the more that I found they had the sensitivities and the challenges and the issues that I did. And so that quest to understand successful people went on for years. And one weekend, I was trying to write a book called Constructive Company, and I couldn't write. I was actually trying to write the book proposal for Constructive Company. A major publisher wanted me to write a book, and I got to the point where you talk about who's going to buy the book, describe your market, and I had 300 words to describe entrepreneurs, and I couldn't. I was so blocked. It should have been easy. Yeah. I'd worked with entrepreneurs. I was an entrepreneur. I'd coached entrepreneurs. There shouldn't have been any type of block or hesitation, but I couldn't do it. And I remember getting up and going and telling Katie I was struggling. I had a glass of water. I came back to my desk and I'm like, okay, I'm just going to remove the 300-word limitation and I'm going to write whatever comes out. And joy, I started typing, and it was a Saturday. And by the end of the weekend, I had 25,000 words. And I just didn't stop. And we ended up taking everything that I wrote and editing it down and putting it in order. And it became that both the entrepreneurial personality type. We actually pulled a lot out of it. I know entrepreneurs like to do things fast. They like quick information. And so we wanted it to be about under a 2-hour read, even for someone who's dyslexic like me. So if you read really fast, it's 45 minutes. If you read really slow, it's about 2 hours. And the book is my hypothesis on why people like us are who we are. And I wanted to write a book that explained our behaviors in a way that made everything make sense. And when I look at entrepreneurs throughout history, Steve Jobs is an interesting example because he clearly was one of the most brilliant visionaries of our time, and he got the best work out of people, and he inspired so many different industries. He changed the world in so many different ways. Still equations that are running right now that had Steve Jobs not been there, who knows if they would be. And at the same time, he was difficult and challenging, and he hurt people's feelings, and he did not create safe spaces like we talk about these days. Like, all of Apple was not a safe space if Steve Jobs was in the building. And that dichotomy, that kind of bipolar type behavior, not in the psychological sense of the world, but in being having polarity, is so common in entrepreneurs. The Einstein couldn't tie his shoe and failed algebra, became one of the greatest physicists of all time. Those types of things you see over and over again. And when I look at who we are as entrepreneurs, for me, I have this hypothesis that the definition of an entrepreneurial personality type is we are physiologically sensitive, momentum-based beings that are highly reactive to constraint. So when Jobs was in momentum, when he was excited, when things were going his way, everybody loved him. He could get up on a stage and inspire literally the entire world in 20 minutes. But when he was in constraint, when things were slowed down, when things got in his way, he was a tyrant, and he was terrifying, and all those other things. And when you look at any entrepreneur's positive and challenging behaviors, I feel like it's when we're in momentum and out of momentum. When the pressure and noise goes too high, we show up as challenged. We show up as symptomatic. And so the argument I make is that the entrepreneurial personality type is really the evolutionary hunter. We've been programmed for millennia to get up every day, go into the future, create this new reality of being on the hunt and getting something done. We come back to the present and we demand it becomes real. And the energy, the psychic power that it takes to do that, the psychological power that it takes to do that, is not resonant in the average human being. No. But for people like us, it doesn't go away, and you can't turn it off. And so we are fundamentally different than the rest of the world. And I feel like we are the most misunderstood population there is.
And it's so incredibly hard, because sometimes you feel so alone, especially if you're in a society where it's not a norm. If you're not surrounded by people like yourself, it's like you just feel so incredibly alone. And it's so sad. And that's one of the reasons why I started this podcast, because the entrepreneurial journey is quite lonely. And sometimes you're just surrounded by people that just don't understand it. They don't get you. When I read this little book, I was almost in tears. Well, actually, I was in tears, because it was for the first time I felt somebody actually understood how I feel.
Yeah.
Alex, one of the things that is also, which I have right here, is the Billionaire Code. Now, I know you've spoken a lot about the Billionaire Code, and I don't want to dive too deep into it, but can you just give us, how did the Billionaire Code come about? How did it really start?
It's interesting. If you look at the entrepreneurial personality type, there's this chapter called the Entrepreneurial Life of Questions. And when I read the stories of entrepreneurs, I started to see patterns. One of them is the contribution equation. I think every great entrepreneur in history did 4 things to be successful. First, they lowered the pressure and noise in their life. By lowering the pressure and noise, I mean, they started eating the right foods. They started taking care of themselves. They started saying no to the things they needed to say no to. It's actually in the story of every wildly successful entrepreneur. They started flying private jets. They started getting assistance and help and delegating the tactical. And the second thing is, they didn't just lower pressure and noise, they increased protection and support. They started actually asking for help. It's one of the hardest things for us to do. Asking for help I call it the entrepreneur's dilemma. We need far more help than the average person, but every request for help leaves us feeling leaves us feeling vulnerable and exposed. But if you look at successful people, they did it. And the third thing is, if you lower pressure and noise and increase protection and support, your strengths and abilities show. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to go out and teach yourself anything. You just get better at everything if you do those 2 things. Far too many entrepreneurs increase noise, won't ask for help, and then go try and learn how to fix it. And it just doesn't work. And if you do the 3 things, you lower pressure and noise, increase protection and support, your strengths and abilities show, and you'll go make your greatest contribution. Every successful entrepreneur I ever studied did those things. Well, that was one of the first equations for me that emerged from studying entrepreneurs. But if you read the stories of 50 or 100 entrepreneurs, they kind of look disparate. They look different. If you read 500 or 1,000, or you get to where, I've studied so many, I've lost count. I don't know how many books I've read and how many articles and third-party accounts and synopsis and biographies and articles. And anytime somebody's successful, I chase it down. I want to figure out how they got there. And the Entrepreneurial Life of Questions is the 9 questions I believe get us from where we start to where we want to be. And, it starts with, how do I stop pressure and noise? I think every one of us has been in that place where we don't want to have the noise anymore. And the second one is, what is wrong with me? And because we feel like there's something wrong with us, this equation opens up like, how do I get ahead? And the how do I get ahead? And then how do I get even further ahead? It's like we figure something out. Now we want more. And then most entrepreneurs never make this leap. But the next question is, how does my team get me ahead? How do we surround ourselves with the people who are going to help us? And then we have this tectonic shift from me to we, where it's, instead of how does my team get me ahead, how does my team get ahead? How do these people around me, how do I focus on them? And then how does my team get even further ahead? And then how do we help others get ahead? And how do we help everyone? And that became like this meditation for me for years. I'm like, I think this is the path to entrepreneurial success.
Yeah.
And I went to an event where Clayton Mask, the CEO of, no, you know what? That's not what happened. One of the first things that happened, CEO of Infusionsoft shared, and he shared this matrix where he had kind of put numbers to what to those questions. And I looked at it and I thought, you know what? It's not just the entrepreneurial life of questions. This is what we go through to start a business. You start the business and you're the very first phase, and it's like, how do I stop the pressure and noise? Yes. Then everybody seems like they're doing better than you, and what is wrong with me? And so what I finally did was assigned categories to it. Like, this is the first category, the second category, the third category. Then I got some numbers from the U.S. Small Business Administration, and the numbers line up with those questions. And so I kind of backed into the Billionaire Code first by understanding what is the base level question that entrepreneurs ask at each level of growth, and what should we be asking? And so it developed into this matrix that now we use as the back end for our coaching program. It's been downloaded about tens of thousands of times. Yeah. It shows up in a lot of different books with different names on it. It shows up in a lot of other people's products with different names on it. But, and I think it's because, Joy, I've gone out and shared it tons of times. Yeah. And nobody ever comes up and says, hey, I think you're wrong. Entrepreneurs just look at it and say, man, that Billionaire Code is just truth.
It's amazing. Yeah. I have shared it with so many people, because when you look at it, it is like, wow. And it's amazing how something so simple can be so impactful. Obviously it wasn't formed out of simplicity, but it's just, it's amazing.